Introduction to Business, Chapter 6, Global Environment. Globalization refers to economies that are more interconnected than they had been before on a global basis rather than on a domestic or a local level. International business refers to the commerce in which goods, services, and resources between two or more nations. Globalization is more than just simply international business because globalization also refers to a shift towards companies that are acting as global citizens as opposed to companies that are dedicated to one location. These companies and the different economies around the world are more integrated than they had been in the past, which means that cultures, ideas, beliefs, products, and goods and services are exchanged, as well as natural resources imported and exported between countries. This can have some beneficial aspects to the economy because it can improve the economy for various countries that are involved in trade, but it can also result in some trade wars. It can result in some risk systemically, meaning that it affects the economy all around the world. In the past, in a non-globalized economy, if one nation was having some economic issues, it would usually be segregated from the rest of the world. But because the supply chains that are involved today are so interconnected between different countries, when one country has an economic issue, it can spread very rapidly to other countries as well. We'll use McDonald's as an example of some of the impacts of globalization. McDonald's has franchises. We'll talk about franchises in a couple more chapters down the road. But McDonald's operates by having as many locations as they can to reach as many customers as they can. The more customers under one umbrella, McDonald's, the more money they can make, the more profit they can turn. So some of the challenges that McDonald's or companies like McDonald's would face include issues tied to the global economic environment, the global legal environment, the global competitive environment, the global technological environment, and the global social environment. These are issues that all happen domestically that you have to be aware of. You have to understand the politics, the economy, the legal issues with each jurisdiction where these companies are located, as well as the competition and any technology and social and cultural norms. But rather than just focusing on your domestic area or your domestic market, you have to consider how you would be able to do business all around the world when the laws are different, when the economies are different, when the standards of living are different, and when different societies have different cultures and different requirements that they are looking for. In the global economic environment, McDonald's is a corporation, which I believe we'll do in the next chapter or two. We'll talk about the different types of companies like sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations. But it's a corporation, meaning that they sell shares of ownership to people on the public market who are willing to become owners. The more shares you own, the more money you can make when the company pays out profits. McDonald's is based in the United States. It started in California and spread around the country during the 1950s and 60s, and then eventually it became pretty much ubiquitous. You could find a McDonald's practically everywhere. You'd be hard-pressed to go more than one town or two when you're traveling and not find a McDonald's. The problem is when you saturate the market in one country, you only have a limited number of customers that you could reach. There's only 330 million people in the United States. There's over 7 billion, approaching 8 billion people in the world. So if you want to expand your company, you're going to have to go internationally so that you can get access to more customers. That's what McDonald's has done. So part of the thing that McDonald's has to look at in the global economic environment is that there are 164 different currencies. There's the United States dollar, there's the euro in Europe for the European Union, there's the pound for Great Britain, because even though they were part of the Union, they never gave up their currency. And then through Brexit, they actually left the European Union. But most countries have either a shared currency or they have their own currency. And because each country has a different standard of living, the value of that dollar or pound or euro or whatever it may be will have different trading values when you try to convert things from one country to another. So if I wanted to go to Britain, I would have to use dollars and then buy pounds with it. And the value of the pound to the dollar is going to be different because each country, just like every company, has different stock prices. Each country has different issues that would make people think that their currency was more valuable or less valuable. In the global legal environment, there are laws all over the world. I think we'll talk a little bit later, and you'll see this in the video that I have linked that shows McDonald's around the world. If you want to run a McDonald's, which is a hamburger restaurant primarily, and you want to do business in India with almost 1.5 billion people, there may be an issue because one of the predominant religions in India holds the cow as sacred, and it's culturally and in some cases legally improper for you to slaughter a cow to get the meat, which is typically what is used in hamburgers. So you'd have to change your products a little bit to fit the cultures and the laws and the social mores from around the world. I believe the text had an example of Greece where there's a fine for eating ice cream near historic, artistic, and culturally important sites like the Parthenon and other ancient ruins. The question is, should McDonald's sell ice cream near these sites? I don't know if it's necessarily a question for McDonald's selling ice cream near these sites because McDonald's is not the only place in the world that would sell ice cream. I'm sure there are Greek restaurants or ice cream stands that would sell ice cream, but you have to be aware when you're going into another country that you may be perceived differently because you are a foreigner. You're providing a service in another country, but your profits may be going back to another country. McDonald's, those golden arches are recognizable all over the world, both positively and negatively. Countries like France, which have a very high level of cuisine awareness, they have rules about how to make bread and the baguettes and croissant and all the other things that they eat there. They don't want McDonald's near some of their historic landmarks because they feel that it Americanizes the place or it gives it a cheaper feel to it. The competitive environment is much more intense on a global basis because not only are you going to be competing against Burger King or the local hamburger and pizza joints in any location in the United States locally, you're going to be competing against other large corporations that also have a presence in various countries around the world. Plus, you'll be competing against the local markets. There is a video that I put on Moodle about 7-Eleven and the kind of troubles that they had, I believe, in Indonesia, because they did have a lot of local competition. On this slide, you can see that there is a Mick kebab. So they do change the menus slightly. And again, you can see that in the video. If you go to India, they have spices that you can put on the French fries and shake them in a bag, which I would kind of like to see here. It just hasn't been determined to be important enough in the United States or enough in demand to offer that as a product here. Key for McDonald's and any other company like them is that when you offer a product, you want to make it as similar as possible from one location to the next because it makes it a lot easier to prepare the food. If you're making one type of food over and over again, it becomes very easy to do it effective and efficiently and get the prices to be low. Typically, one McDonald's in Boston is not going to be different from the McDonald's in Somerville or Malden or wherever. But if you go to another country, the tastes of the particular culture that you're going to may demand that the menu change if you want to be competitive, especially if there are local companies that you're trying to get business from. The technological environment relates to the various global demands created by technology. What technology does on a global level is it opens up competition far more than it had been before because you can access information and make purchases and sales and review products online where you used to have to go to the country or converse by snail mail and send things over and do contracts. It would take sometimes weeks to get a business deal done where you can do it pretty much instantaneously as if you were in the same country because of the internet. Technology has also made purchasing products a lot simpler. Even if you go into a local McDonald's, most of them don't really have people at the cash register anymore. They do have some, in case you need to talk to someone, but most of them have these electronic kiosks where you can order. They have apps on your phone. You can go through the computer. You can do a lot of different things in order to get your order through to make it a little bit quicker and more efficient. It's good for McDonald's because if they offer this, it can decrease their payroll. They don't have to hire as many people if most of it is self-serve in terms of at least ordering, not necessarily preparing the food. But it also is important to note that if you don't offer these types of technological advantages to your customers, other companies may be doing the same thing. So if other companies have a mobile app where you can order food, you're probably going to have to do that too because customers begin to expect that as a matter of convenience. The global social environment, I've touched upon it already a couple of times. You have to adapt in a lot of different ways because tastes aren't the same in every country. McDonald's is American food and they do provide largely American style food, but they will cater it to the particular tastes of the area where they're going. And this slide also does mention that they have a veggie burger and they use lamb or other meat like chicken instead of beef from a cow. So on a global economic scale, the way you look at one country and their competitiveness against another, these are terms, the competitive terms are absolute and comparative advantage. So if you have one nation, it could be a country, a region, or a company, or even down to the individual, you have an absolute advantage if you're the only source of a particular product or good. That doesn't typically happen very much, but there are countries that have close to an absolute advantage. If you are a nation that needs gold or diamonds, there's some countries in Africa that have very high outputs of that compared to other nations around the world. It's very rare that you would have only one product or one natural resource from a particular country, but if you did, you would be in an excellent marketing or trading situation because no one else is able to compete with you. It's essentially like having a monopoly. A comparative advantage is when you don't have the absolute monopoly type of advantage, but you do have a particular good or service that you can produce at a lower price or a lower opportunity cost compared to other countries or other companies. I mentioned that earlier in class. So, for example, if we live in New England, we may be able to grow cranberries here because of the nature of our environment, the climate. We can get maple syrup. There's a lot of other things that are kind of more indigenous to this particular area. But if you want to have an orange or a banana, you're going to have to go to other places that have an advantage in climate to be able to grow that. Everybody drinks coffee. We have Dunkin' Donuts all over the place. In fact, the company was founded in Massachusetts, but coffee doesn't grow in New England. All of that is going to have to be imported from South America or Asia, where the climate allows them the opportunity to have a competitive advantage over here. In this case, we call it a comparative advantage because if you wanted to grow coffee, I suppose you could. You might have to have a greenhouse to do it, but that would increase your costs. Global markets and business opportunity on this slide. As I mentioned previously, you can get benefits by going into another foreign market. The biggest one is to expand your customer base, which is why I said if McDonald's has saturated the United States, there's only so many customers you're going to get. So you have to go to Canada and Mexico and Europe and Asia and other places around the world in order to get access to those customers that you haven't tapped into yet. There's also the ability to get access to factors of production because you can get access to natural resources that you may not get here. You could get more investment from around the world. You could hire people that are specialized in the particular things that you're trying to get because they're familiar with it in their own domestic market. So if things are too expensive here, you can go someplace else to get access to them. You can also come up with more innovation and more ideas. Typically, if you are kind of insulated, you have an incestuous body of ideas. You're only talking to the same few people, so they're only going to come up with so many ideas. If you bring in people from elsewhere, they can contribute things that you may not have been able to think of because they came from a different environment. If you go around the world, when you ask people how to do things in different countries, there will be a different way of doing it. It may be better, it may be worse, it may be kind of the same, but just a different process of doing it. And by being exposed to all of these different ideas, you can put them together and create some kind of a hybrid process that would be superior to what you were doing previously. The idea of risk reduction is related to the fact that if you're going to enter into a global marketplace and you are buying your factors of production and getting access to these resources, it's a good idea to mix up the number of countries that you're getting them from. It's kind of the same idea about when you invest in stocks. They tell you to diversify. If I have $100,000 and I invested in one company and that company goes bankrupt, I lose all of my money. If I have $100,000 and I invested in 50 companies, then if one company goes bad, some other companies are going to be doing better. So it's a way to mitigate risk or to reduce risk by spreading it out. If I'm totally reliant on one country to get me my coffee beans or one country to get me a particular type of metal that I use in my production, and there's a problem, either there's a war or natural disaster or some type of political obstruction standing in the way from importing that, if I've only got one source to get it from, then I'm going to be out of business. I'm going to have to either try to find another place on short notice, which would be very difficult and very expensive to do, or if I had multiple places to get it from, I could simply go to plan B and C and D until I can get enough of the resources necessary to operate on a normal basis. Balance of trade is what you look at when you're comparing one country's trade to another. It's the difference between the value of one country's imports and its exports. Imports are all the products that it brings in from other countries. Exports are all the products that they sell to other countries. If you import a lot more than you export, then you have an imbalance of trade, or at least you will have the ability to come up with the dollar value. So you look at all the value of your exports, let's say it's $1 billion, and the value of our imports are $2 billion. We bring in more than we export. The balance of trade is a negative $1 billion. If you take accounting, it's very similar to doing the balance sheet of a company. Money in, money out. Are we making money or are we losing money? In trade, it's okay to have an imbalance of trade. You could have a negative balance because it is providing your consumers access to products and services or goods and services that they may not ordinarily have access to. However, if you continually import more than you export, you tend to have money leaving your economy and going to other places. I mentioned class a little bit earlier that that's not necessarily always a bad thing. because the countries that are now making more money because you're importing more from them, they now have money to spend and they could buy some of your exports and start to balance it out over time. However, the United States typically has a trade imbalance. We typically import far more than we export. We still manufacture a lot and we still have a huge amount of exports, but we import an awful lot of things, largely because the economy here is mature, it's an expensive place to live, and therefore it's expensive to hire people to build things. If you hire people to build things in another country where it's cheaper and you import those products, your consumer get access to cheaper prices on their products. A trade deficit is when you have more imports than it exports. So like I said, in the example of the United States, we have a trade deficit. There's more goods coming in that we're paying for than there are goods going out that we're getting money from. A trade surplus is the opposite. It's when you export more than you import. That means you have a surplus. The balance of trade is in your favor. And when you calculate this, you are looking at all imports and exports. You may be running a surplus in certain imports and exports, but you also may be running a deficit in others. When you talk about the overall surplus or deficit, it's all of the products, goods, and services coming in or going out of the country. Balance of payments is similar to the trade surplus and the balance of trade. What we're talking about is the flow of money coming in and out of the country. Money is an asset. It is a resource that you can trade just like anything else. I can buy stock in a company and hope that that stock goes up and then I can sell it and make money. I can also buy currency. If I believe that the United States is in a recession and the dollar is not worth as much as it used to be, but it's coming out of a recession, I could convert a lot of currency that I have to dollars or to pounds or euros or yuan or wherever around the world where I think I may get an advantage. And if that currency grows faster than the currency that you had before, you can then cash it out and exchange it for other payments or other currencies, and then you can make a profit that way. Countries have money coming in, that's the inflow, and the money going out is the outflow. You do the same addition, subtraction, and you come up with the balance of payments. These are all external transactions, including payments, exports, and imports, services, foreign investments, loans, financial capital, and financial transfers. It's anything that's basically a monetary exchange across borders. Countertrade is similar in a way to bartering, which we'll talk about in another slide or two. Countertrade is when, rather than me buying something from you, I exchange something for what you're giving me. So if you have a lot of bananas and coffee and I have a lot of cranberries and maple syrup and we both have needs for each, we can figure out how to exchange it. If you are a country that doesn't have a lot of currency for whatever reason, you don't have a currency that's traded at a high enough level, or you have a currency that just isn't really marketable on the global economy, then you may just go right to trading one item for another. So goods or services for other goods and services. This happens more frequently in developing countries where the currency is weak or there could be some kind of conflict that would create a difficulty in getting dollars. There is no global currency, but dollars are typically used more frequently than any other. Euro is probably pretty close second, and the pound is up there as well. For example, oil, which is a global commodity, is sold by the barrel, however many gallons they consider to be in a barrel. But the pricing is always in dollars. And if you don't have dollars in your pocket and you want oil, it would be hard for you to be able to purchase it using cash. But if you have products or services that you're able to give up in exchange for that oil, then that would be called counter trade. Common types of counter trade, like I said, it does include bartering. Bartering is an exchange of goods and services for other goods and services. And that can happen in international trade or global trade, but it can also happen at the local level. In colonial America, where you might not have had an awful lot of money and the free flow of money wasn't available because we didn't have a central banking system, if I was a farmer and I had a certain amount of food and you had a different type of food, we could just do an exchange. We'd figure out how much it's worth to me, how much is, a bushel of oats worth to you compared to a bushel of wheat. Or if I need a pair of shoes and I'm a carpenter, I can build you something in exchange for you to do that. Bartering is still kind of an ongoing thing. The IRS and the Department of Revenue hate it because it's hard to tax. When you have money changing hands, you can just say, the sales tax is 5.05% or whatever it may be in the jurisdiction where you're located. If I exchange one good or service in exchange for another good or service, it's hard to really evaluate or value cost or the price or the value of those exchanges. So how do you pay taxes on it? Dentists, for example, have been known to take care of other families. Why do I want to go to a dentist? I'm a dentist. Why do I want to send my family to another dentist when I'm capable of doing it? But at the same time, I don't necessarily want to be my kid's dentist. That would be kind of weird. So if I have another dentist in my practice and they have kids, I can take care of his kids and he can take care of my kids and we won't pay each other. However, we are getting a benefit and we are exchanging something of value. It's very difficult for the IRS to figure out how to tax that. In the 1980s, when there was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was the communist nation primarily operated by Russia and some of the satellite nations around it, like the Baltics and East Germany, their currency, the ruble, was not traded on the global market. Because they were a communist nation, they were not part of the free market and their money was not exchangeable. So if you wanted to import something from Russia, how could you do it? If you gave them dollars, they would just give you rubles back and then you couldn't spend it anywhere except in Russia. So bartering was actually a way they used countertrade in order to get some Russian products. And it was kind of an ingenious idea. There's a Russian vodka called Stolichnaya, and Russia is famous for vodka. The only way that you can import it and pay for it was not to use currency. A distributor came up with the idea that they would import Stolichnaya vodka and they would export Pepsi. So Russians in the Soviet Union in the 1980s had access to Pepsi, and the United States consumers had access to Stolichnaya vodka, but they never exchanged currency in order to complete the transaction. Switch trading is simply selling an obligation to make a purchase in another country. So if I have a contract to buy a certain amount of a particular resource from one country and I don't need it anymore, I can then go to a third party and have them stand in my place and pick up the obligation to do it in exchange for some other obligation or maybe a good or service or even cash. A counter purchase is a sale of goods and services from one company into another country, not necessarily in return for a product like in bartering or even currency in general trade, but a future promise that you will purchase some type of product from that company in the future. When you go into working in another country, it can be very expensive to start from scratch. If an American firm went to another nation, you would have to learn the building codes, you'd have to figure out what all the requirements were, the permitting. It can be very complicated. So what you could do is contract with a firm to build a plant or an office space for you in the other country that you want to go into, or they could supply the technology, the equipment, the services, training, whatever it may be. And in return, they get a piece of the revenue that you produce once you move in and start operating in that country. That could either be a partial payment, sometimes it could be the full payment, but usually it's a percentage. So if I don't want to kick in $100 million to build a new manufacturing plant, maybe I pay 30 or $40 million and then I agree to give them a percentage of our product's revenue stream for the next 20 years or something until they're satisfied that the cost has been paid for. An offset is when one company exchanges a hard currency purchase for some other product in the future. It's kind of similar to a counter purchase, but rather than in a counter purchase where you have goods and services for goods and services in the future, here you're taking a good or service in exchange for money, or you're offsetting the value of that money with a good and service in the future. All of these are just different versions of the same thing, and it gives you opportunities to come up with a solution that fits the particular situation that you're in. If you could only buy things with dollars, you would be very limited in what you're doing. So all of these, depending on the situation, it may make sense. And all of these also may be subject to various laws and regulations for taxes and trade that you need to be aware of before you start investing in it. You have to do your due diligence and make sure that you're not going to run into a roadblock somewhere down the road. So it's never a good idea to start spending money before you know what you're spending it on and if it's going to be permissible. So trade involves importing and exporting. As we said about the balance of trade, exporting is when you take goods and services from one company in a country and ship it to another country. The country that is shipping them out is an exporter. The company bringing things in are importers. You can have companies that do nothing but handle the transaction. If I manufacture goods and I want to export them to Canada, I'm good at manufacturing goods. I'm not necessarily good at understanding all the nuance of the regulations and trade agreements. So I can go to a company that serves as an agent to facilitate an agreement for trade. So you could be an exporting company and all you do is deal with domestic companies and help them figure out how to sell it in another country. And you could do importing too. You could get other countries from foreign locations and have them import goods to your local area. An importing and exporting company doesn't necessarily make anything on their own. What they do is they facilitate the transaction. The advantages of importing and exporting. Exporting doesn't mean that you have to manufacture the products where you're manufacturing them. If you're in the United States, however, and you're manufacturing something here because the costs are typically going to be higher because our standard of living is high, it may be difficult to compete on a price point in another country where labor is cheaper. However, you don't have to go to the expense of building a manufacturing plant in another country. You already have that all here. So when you have the finished product, you're just shipping it out. It's also the quickest and least expensive means and also the least amount of risk to enter into another marketplace around the globe. As I said, exporting is the easiest. The next would be having a licensing agreement with some other company in another country to sell your product. You could hire somebody in the other country to build your product, or you could actually invest in the capital to build a facility in the other country and build it there. That is the most expensive, and because it's the most expensive, it's also the most risky. The least expensive and least risky way of doing it, but potentially the least effective way of doing it, is simply to export. The disadvantages means that once your product leaves your company or the country's shores, you don't know how they're being used, how they're maybe being marketed. They may be lying about what their capabilities are, and you could have a relatively bad reputation if people think that they're buying one thing and it's being advertised as another. That part of it is out of your hands to a large degree, unless you have a particular agreement that puts restrictions on it. Because you are not operating directly in another country, you don't really know what type of insight is necessary to be able to market things to satisfy the preferences of the local population. You're like one step removed from the supply and demand issues, so it's harder to really gauge how effective a particular marketplace will be because you do not have direct experience with it. And the other thing is exporting as a disadvantage can incur taxes, regulations, or restrictions. And these taxes, regulations, and restrictions may change sometimes without notice. So if you invest $50 million to go to another country and everything's fine for a year, then maybe they think that you're a threat. They start taxing you more by putting tariffs on your products. They could change the regulations, so you may have to change your manufacturing capabilities to be able to satisfy them. Or there could be a quota, meaning that you can only sell a certain number of things in that country. Those can change after you've already established it, so there is some level of risk for that. Outsourcing and offshoring. Outsourcing is when you take some type of business process that you're currently doing and have someone else do it. Usually, if that happens domestically, I've got maybe a small company and I've got 20 people here, and I don't want to do payroll because it's kind of a pain. It's not super complicated, but it is time consuming. And if I spend time doing that, according to the rule of opportunity costs, I can't do something else with my time. So why not just hire a company that does nothing but payroll? So I can have a contract with that company to do all of my payroll, maybe all of my HR. Maybe I hire an accounting company to do my taxes. That's called outsourcing. It depends on whether or not it makes sense from a cost benefit analysis that whether you should outsource or not. If I'm a big enough company and I have millions of dollars in taxes and revenues coming in, I may want to just hire my own accountants because it's worth it. But if I'm a smaller company, why do I want to pay $250,000 to a few people to be accountants when I could just pay a fee for someone else to do it? I could fix my car myself. I probably wouldn't do a particularly good job on it because I'm not a mechanic. It would take me longer and the job might not be done particularly well. I might be able to save dollars in doing it, but the real expense of it could be worse if the car isn't fixed correctly or if I'm spending too much time on it. What I could do instead is simply go to a mechanic, pay them to use their expertise, even though it'll be more expensive in a nominal sense in terms of the dollars I'm paying. It can actually provide more value because it would be cheaper for me in the long run because I get a better product or I get a better service by an expert instead of myself investing all of my time and money in trying to accomplish the same thing. Offshoring is similar to outsourcing, but it's actually relocating the business process from a country to another. So if I have a manufacturing capability and this country is just too expensive because I have to pay $30 an hour for my manufacturers, I may actually just offshore the whole thing. I'll shut down production here and I'll go to Mexico or I'll go to some other place where the prices are cheaper. I can then have them manufacture all of our equipment. Now, I could have them manufacture all of the products that we're going to be selling back in our domestic market. I could hire a company to just do the licensing, so it could be a contract of it. But the offshoring is actually you going over there and setting up some type of manufacturing plant in another country. The advantages and disadvantages of offshoring and outsourcing include the destination country gains jobs. On the other hand, the location where you had been located previously, they start to lose jobs. So there could be some controversy as a result. The origin country, where you're shipping out the manufacturing or whatever process it is that you're moving to another place, they get back cheaper goods and services. So you are making potentially more money because your expenses have gone down and your revenues may go up when the prices get cheaper. Over time, as countries start to get better at manufacturing, if they're an emerging economy, 30 years ago, when you bought something from China, it was probably going to be things like Christmas decorations. That's the first thing I noticed from China. When I was a kid, you couldn't buy anything from China because they were a closed communist nation. Their economy did not transact with other countries. In the 80s and into the 90s, they started doing some reforms that allowed them to sell things on the global market. And I was getting, Christmas trees and simpler things. As their economy improved because they made so much money, they were able to train their people up. They had better capabilities, and now they're manufacturing phones and computers and very high tech things. That's typically the nature of how it works. When you go to a cheaper country, they start to develop a better economy because they have more jobs and more money coming in, and then they can get better at it. The downside of that is over time, they become a more expensive place as well. China at some point is probably going to have a standard of living that is going to make their manufacturing less advantageous compared to other countries, perhaps in the region or other places around the world. Africa has got a huge population. They have a huge untapped work population. That's going to be the next real big emerging market. And I think you're going to see a lot of manufacturing move there when places like China begin to become too expensive because their economies are advancing. After World War II, Japan was basically destroyed during the war, and many things in the United States in the 50s and 60s were imported from Japan. With the exception of cars and some manufactured technological goods, Japan doesn't make quite as many things that used to be imported. They got replaced by China because as Japan's economy became better, it became more expensive for them to manufacture products and goods. So as China becomes more mature and they start making more money, they will advance into higher levels. They'll become more expensive. Other emerging countries will probably be the place where you'll want to outsource to. The disadvantages are when you have people in other countries manufacturing it, you don't have direct control over the product quality, working conditions, and labor relations. That's typically going to be people that you hire over there that are familiar with the laws and the society and the culture. Now, the argument could be that the jobs that are shipped overseas are not replaced here by better, higher paying jobs. There's a lot of studies that are going on there. You can make an argument either way. Over time, it does appear that the jobs in the target countries where you move the products to or you move the manufacturing capacity to, they do improve. There's not as much evidence that the jobs that were abandoned here in the United States are better, higher paying jobs. A lot of what happened in the United States is when the manufacturing jobs left, they were replaced by lower paying service jobs, like in retail, for example. Licensing is another low risk way of being able to get access to another market. So you basically sign an agreement with somebody, it's a contract. You are the licensee, you are letting someone else use your product. The licensee is the party getting the product and being able to sell it. The licensor is the party that makes the product and owns the intellectual property and the patents behind it. A basic example of this is if you buy, let's say you want to get a Patriots shirt. The Patriots own the logo. They market the shirts because that's part of the things, that's how they make money. They sell different products aside from having a football team. But the Patriots are a football team. They don't have capabilities to manufacture products, but they own the patent on the logo and the design of the shirt. So what they do is they have an officially licensed product or a licensed product of the National Football League. If you go to a store, you'll see they'll have a little tag on it. It's licensed. So the Patriots will hire Nike or Reebok or whoever to go ahead and produce their product. It's their product, but it's being made by somebody else. And when you go to Nike and Reebok or whoever it is that's making these, they are probably using offshored manufacturing capacity in other countries to produce those products. So the licensing agreement is intangible. That is, it's a right to do something rather than an actual exchange of products or services. It tends to be a little bit less risky because you don't have to have as much capital investment in another jurisdiction. Franchising is when a master company, the franchisor, allows another party, the franchisee, to run essentially one of their businesses. There's a picture of Baskin-Robbins on there, but there's a whole lot of franchises that are out there, and we'll cover it more detail in a subsequent chapter when we talk about entrepreneurship. McDonald's used a franchise agreement. What McDonald's could do is they could just own every McDonald's restaurant. They would have to manage all of them. They would have to have a very large centralized management capacity to do that. They don't do that. The way that they expand, however, is they sign franchise agreements. So if you want to run a McDonald's, you are the owner of the McDonald's. You have to buy or rent the location. You have to build a McDonald's restaurant there. All of the materials and equipment that you have to buy. But you have essentially a license through your franchising agreement to sell the Big Macs and the Cokes and everything else that McDonald's does. They provide you with training, and in return, they get a piece of your profit. It's a lower risk for the franchisee and for the franchisor, because if I wanted to open up a restaurant, there's a very high risk that it would fail, especially if I'm not particularly adept at running a restaurant. The people at McDonald's have been doing this for 50, 60, 70 years. They have a process in place, and all I have to do is do it well. They've already developed the whole thing, and it's a proven model. McDonald's doesn't have to own all of these individual places. They just have to make sure that the contracting party, the franchisee, is doing what they're supposed to be doing so they can protect their brand image. So licensing and franchising, they're very similar. In fact, licensing is included in franchising, as I mentioned. The advantages are it allows you to have a global presence without really investing heavily. You can just get the franchisee contract agreement from whatever country you want to go to, and you can give them the training, and then you get a cut of their profits. So it's a lower risk way to make money and get access to new customers without having to put up a whole lot of capital investment right away. The disadvantages are it's not a particularly profitable way to enter a market. The percent that you're going to get is maybe 5, 10, 15%. When you own the company, when you own the franchise, if you have the restaurant and it's part of your company, all of the money that makes goes to you. This way you are kind of diluting the amount of profit, but because you can expand much more rapidly for less money, it doesn't really matter that much because you're selling so many more products that even if you take a lower cut, you can still make more money than if you had to go to the expense of opening each place by yourself individually. You may lose some brand control. Again, if you have a franchise in another country, they are not your employees, they're employees of the franchisee. And if they're not really doing what they're supposed to be doing, quality could suffer, your reputation could take a hit. It's harder to manage because it's not direct control. On a more global scale, as opposed to for the company's getting less of a cut because they're only getting a percentage of the money that's going out, but the money that's being made stays in the other country, except for the amount of money that they have to kick back to the franchisor or the licensor. So in the United States, when McDonald's opens up all these other restaurants, that's good for McDonald's, but these are not Americans that are getting the jobs. The money that's being transacted is being kept by the owners of the franchise or of the franchise in the other countries. McDonald's is just getting their cut that's coming from the franchise agreement. Foreign direct investment, this is more expensive and therefore more risky. You actually control the ownership in the other country by either building a plant or buying an existing business, and you manage it directly. So you can do it in one of two ways. There are things known as greenfield ventures. A greenfield venture is when a company enters a foreign market and sets up a subsidiary to start the business over there. So the example that they gave on the slide is BMW has their own business in Germany, but they can set up a BMW America and run an operating plant in South Carolina and manufacture cars locally. Mergers and acquisitions, however, are by far the predominant way of doing it. So instead of going and starting from scratch and building, let's say I'm Ford, I could go to Germany and build a Ford plant, and I'd have to buy the land, build the plant myself, manage it ourselves, hire everybody to do it, just like we were doing it locally. But what I could do is go and find a company that is already in existence, buy them out, convert them to be part of our company so that the expense and the risk is a little bit less. We already have a going concern in another country that is already familiar with it. They already have employees there. We just buy them and make them part of our company. Advantages of direct foreign investment, you get access to much more a percentage of the profit, or you can have a greater level of profit because you are the direct owner of it. And buying something that already exists means that they already have processes in place that you can take advantage of without having to reestablish them yourself, which can take time and money. The disadvantage is that there's a lot more investment. And if you put a lot more money into something that doesn't work, there's a lot greater risk of loss. There could be a lot of red tape. That just means bureaucratic processes. If you have to file for permits, pay taxes, Different countries have different requirements for their employees. A lot of them provide a lot more benefits, especially in Europe compared to American employees. You can't fire people the way you can fire them in the United States. So you have to be aware of the different rules when you go to a different jurisdiction, and red tape can add up. I mean, the more you have to address all the different things that are required by the government, the more money it's going to cost you. Greenfield ventures take time, as well as companies and mergers and acquisitions. You have cultural differences. You have literal cultural differences between different companies, between different countries. But if I buy a company and I'm converting them to be our company, they have to relearn how to do a few things, even though they already exist and they're going to be able to jump into it quicker. We have different rules that we're probably going to try to implement. The other thing is when you're buying a company in a foreign market, it may be difficult to evaluate or value how much their business is worth. If I'm buying a domestic company, it's a lot easier to track. If they're a publicly traded company, I have access to a lot more information. I'll be able to get a good price on them and know whether it's worth it. When you go to another country, you may not have access to as much information. And if you don't have access to the information, you're going to have to make assumptions that may or may not be correct. So you could end up overpaying by mistake. A joint venture is when two companies get together and they operate as an independent business, or they maintain their current businesses, but they act in a cooperative fashion. So you could have two companies setting up a new firm. Let's say I'm a car manufacturing company and you own a battery company, and we can get together to make electric vehicles. We don't want to necessarily spend the time to develop how to make the electric motors and the electric batteries. You already know how to do it. Let's join together and we'll have a new company consisting of both of us producing products that neither one of us currently make. Joint ventures also occur with existing companies. For example, I know that Ford and Mazda have a lot of joint ventures. So you can buy a Mazda car with some Ford components. I know you can buy some Ford cars with a Mazda engine. It's just a way to make more efficiencies. If there's an easier way to do something, if there's a car that has emissions that already meet the requirements for a particular jurisdiction, you can build the framework and you can buy the engine that already meets the requirements there. You can do a joint venture for that purpose as well. A strategic alliance is when two or more companies get together from their home country, and it's usually for a specified period of time. They're trying to accomplish some objective, and when it's completed, it's going to go away. It's not like a joint venture because you're not forming a new company. It's more or less a project that you're trying to fulfill. Advantages of joint ventures: you have knowledge and experience of the local market when you buy or merge with another partner, and it can reduce your exposure to losses because you already have something there that exists rather than trying to create it from scratch. The disadvantages are you don't necessarily have as much control over the firm because you are partnering with someone else, so you do not get to make all of the decisions yourself. Joint venture agreements contractually can become very difficult, especially if one company has proprietary information. If I've got some secret sauce in my food that I don't want the competitors to know about, like Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC, there are 11 herbs and spices. The Coca-Cola recipe is famously still secret. If you don't want the other parties to know it, you have to make sure you either have means by which to prevent them from getting it, or if you have to share it with them, you have to have a contract that creates consequences if they leak that information to someone else. The other thing is the joint venture partner could become better at what they do or better understand what you do. And when the joint venture either fails or ceases to exist, they could become one of your competitors and have information that they could use against you. Global trade involves socioeconomic differences. Different countries have different things that are appealing to them or acceptable to them. There are political issues, different laws in different jurisdictions. Even in the United States, the laws in Massachusetts and New Hampshire are different. The laws between countries are different as well. Physical and environmental forces, you may have different laws. Again, in different countries, you may have better infrastructure in some places. You may have deep ports, so you could have big shipping containers. You may have other countries that don't have access to the deep ports or airports or paved roads, so that could be problematic. You could have environmental laws that are more stringent in one country and less stringent in another. And because of what we talked about before, where you could end up with a trade war, if one country sees that another country is flooding the market with cheaper products and it's destroying your economy because people are losing jobs, they could start making that product more expensive by charging a tax known as a tariff. Social cultural differences extend to things like language, custom, taboos, general values, just the way people talk, hand gestures. When you're working with other people, things may not fit the way that you're used to. And you have to be aware of it because if you're trying to sell a product in another country, you don't want to do something that's going to offend your potential customers. People in different countries also have different ways of working. Years ago, my wife is Italian. It used to be that they would shut down the businesses in Italy between 10 and 2. You'd work in the morning, go home for lunch, and then go back to work and come home around 7 or 8. That doesn't really exist anymore. Some of the smaller places out in the country, they still do it. But as the globalized economy started to take hold, more people are doing regular 9 to 5 shifts. But those types of variances still exist in different places. You'll also have countries with different religious beliefs, which could spill over into their politics and their customs and their laws. There may be holidays in one country that aren't in another. I remember I went to Italy on my honeymoon and we booked a flight on May 1st, which is not a holiday in the United States, but it's May Day is a holiday. It's like Labor Day in Italy. And we couldn't get a taxi. We couldn't get a bus to the airport. We had to take a taxi and it cost like $80. So you have to be aware of things like that. It was a little bit of an inconvenience for me, but if you run into that when millions of dollars are at stake, it can be very problematic. You can read through the next slide just to get some ideas about how there may be some different cultural differences that can have an impact on business. The political economy refers to the different systems in different countries regarding economy and politics. The political systems are the ones that create the legal system as well. You could have a country that has a closed economy, so it would be very difficult to enter. You may not even want to enter. You could have a country that has very high levels of regulation, or maybe even no regulations, and you don't really like that either for whatever reason. Over time, there is a correlation between countries that have a lot of economic freedom, also reliant on political freedom. Countries that have more political freedom, that are more democratic, typically have more competitive and more open markets. And those countries typically do better in terms of global competition and the economy. If you're going to invest in another country, you want to go to a country where the political system and the economy is stable. I said this in class. Businesses like stability because you can make plans when you have something that's stable. If things are changing every day, it's very difficult to figure it out. So if you have a country that has a political overthrow every few months and they've got different people in power and they keep changing laws, that's going to be a very difficult place to go to. Gross national income per capita, we talked about this in the last slide. In the last class, I had a slide that had a list of everybody, all the countries in the world on per capita. This is a map that just basically colors it out. The darker, the higher the per capita share of their GDP is. And if you look at places like Africa, their GDP per capita is quite low. Europe and the United States and other places have higher relative per capita GDP, or gross national income in this case, because GDP is really just gross domestic product. Gross national income is how much money you make on the global scale as well. So it's a slightly different measure, but it's not surprising that GDP per capita and gross national income per capita is very closely correlated. An emerging market, as I mentioned before, Africa is very likely to be the next big emerging market. The slide here only talks about places like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These already have fairly mature economies, so they're going to be starting to become less attractive if you want really low cost manufacturing. The exchange rate is based on how well a country is performing, typically on a global scale. It's similar to a company's stock price. I might have mentioned this before. If you have a company that's performing really well, people want to buy it. Because people want to buy it, the demand is high, the supply may be more limited, then that currency is worth more relative to other currencies. The exchange rate is when you have one nation's currency and you need to convert it into another, you will have to pay something that reflects the difference in purchasing power of the relative currencies. When you're doing business in another country, if you're in the United States, you're operating with dollars. And if you want to go to Europe, you know it's going to have to be euros. And it's going to be, I think the euro is about, it can fluctuate. The last time I went to Europe, it was about $1.10 per euro. The pound had typically been $1.50 to $2 per pound. So it's much more expensive in London, for example, or in England than it would be in other places that don't have as competitive an exchange rate against the dollar. When Brexit happened, the pound dropped a lot of currency value, and it was almost on a par with the dollar, but it has since recouped and it's advanced a little bit more. You can see the symbols here for different currencies. The first on the top left is the dollar, followed by the euro. I believe that's the yen from Japan, the English pound. Then I believe that's the Mexican peso on the bottom row on the left. The won, which is South Korea. I'm not sure what the third one over on there is. That's, to my knowledge, it's just a different way to write the English pound, but there could be another country that has a pound and they try to differentiate it. And the last one is either the Indian rupee or the Indonesian rupiah. You can go online and look for the currency exchange. Just do a Google for currency exchange, and you can put a dollar in and find out how many of some other country's currency you'd be able to purchase for that. In order to do business in another country, you have to find out if I'm going to sell a hamburger over there, how many euros does it cost, and what is the equivalent over here? Then I can find out whether or not it makes sense to go over there and whether or not I can provide a service or a good that's going to be competitive within the marketplace that I'm targeting. As I said, legal differences, every country has their own laws, so it can be quite complicated. Typically, firms will hire law firms in the country that they're going to go to that specialize in trade and foreign investment. Contract law could be different in different places. A trademark is a government protection of a symbol. If you think about the Coca-Cola symbol, the script letters there, that is owned by Coca-Cola. It is an intangible piece of intellectual property. If somebody else used the same trademark, you could go to court in the United States and sue somebody to make them stop doing it because it's a violation of their property rights. Trademark laws may not be the same in other countries. Same with a patent. A patent is an idea that is protected by the government. If I came up with an idea, I can register it for a patent and nobody can use it except me. Patents usually last a particular period of time to allow me to be able to recoup my investment and make some money. After a while, the patents go away. So, for example, if I'm a company and I invented Tylenol, acetaminophen, I have a patent on it for, say, 7 years. So I invested all the money to figure out what acetaminophen is. It's basically non-aspirin pain reliever. I can sell that almost as a monopoly because nobody else has the right to use it. When the patent expires, I can still sell Tylenol, but other companies can go ahead and use acetaminophen because it's just a way to keep the market competitive. Patents are not designed to last forever. They're designed to provide protection so that you can get innovation and you can recoup the money from your research and development. But over time, we don't want to have monopolies, so we want to have some competition. If you go to CVS, you can buy Tylenol, or you can buy CVS brand acetaminophen, which is essentially the same product that was invented by the makers of Tylenol, but it's off patent. It's known as a generic. Labeling requirements, you may have to put what types of components are in there, whether something causes cancer, how many calories are in food, for example, whether lead paint was used, whether there's any type of toxins involved. The laws for contract, trademark, labeling, and patents can vary from other countries. So if you have a patent in the United States and it's protected, if you go to another country, it may not have the same level of protection. Different countries also have different standards for decency. They may also censor some of the information that you say. Censorship is when the government prevents you from speaking freely. It's not when a company tells its employees what to say or a news organization not publishing something. That is not technically censorship. If the government says that a newspaper can't publish something, that's censorship. If I want to put something on Twitter and I violate their terms and conditions, I could argue it's censorship, but it's not the government doing it. So it's not technically censorship in that regard. I can still say what I'm saying. I just can't use Twitter for it. Some countries do not have free speech. And if you want to do marketing, you may have to run into some issues where whatever communications you're trying to put out to the market, it has to be approved by the government. So that's a little bit different if you're a United States company and you're going to be moving into another territory. Different countries may also have prices that are set by the government. They have different product safety, testing, and quality control issues. Environmental laws can vary, privacy laws can vary, and financial reporting can vary. If you read the news, you will see that the European Union seems to sue Google and Microsoft like every other week because of potential violations of antitrust or anti-monopoly laws that are much more rigorously enforced in Europe than they are in the United States. Physical and environmental differences do exist because the United States has probably more paved roads, railways, and airports and shipping ports than anywhere else in the world. China is catching up in a lot of regards for that. But we have a good infrastructure, we have good communication systems, we have a good electric grid. Other countries that are developing, they may not have all of the capabilities that you need to be able to move your manufacturing capacity there. They may not have enough electricity generation. They may not have railroads so that you can manufacture all of your goods and get them out of the country. So you have to look at the infrastructure capability for all of the places that you're looking to do business in. If you're just selling products somewhere else, you still have to make sure that they have enough money to buy it, the population, and that they have a distribution network that's capable of getting your product to where it needs to be. But if you're manufacturing over there, you definitely need to look at the physical capabilities. Are they going to be able to support and sustain all the requirements that you need to be able to do what your objectives are? There could be trade restrictions. We talked about tariffs, so there could be import tariffs. You could put a quota on, which would restrict the number. Quota is related to the word quantity. So for example, Toyota sells electric vehicles or hybrid electric vehicles in the United States. There is a quota on them. I believe if they sell 20,000, then a tariff kicks in, but you can sell the first 20,000 without it. It's basically a protection for American car companies. There could be local content requirements as well. Foreign businesses may have to use local labor, local resources. So depending on where you're going, you have to be aware of what the rules are. And an embargo I mentioned in class is when there's a complete restriction or cessation of trade. For example, that I used in class, we do not do trade with Cuba. After it became a communist country in 1959, 60, we stopped doing trade with them. They do not import our cars anymore. We're not supposed to import their cigars, although they do exist from time to time. It's an official ban, and there are certain countries out there that we are not able to do business with because the United States government says that we cannot. Other countries may have rules and regulations that you need to be aware of before you decide to invest. This is a slide about tariffs. I've already talked about it in this lecture here, and I've mentioned it in class before, so make sure you do your reading and take a look at this slide. The World Trade Organization is an international organization that is done from an agreement between a lot of the economies around the world. The governments have represented themselves, and they came to an agreement to somehow manage trade. There used to be something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT, that evolved into what is now known as the World Trade Organization. So they look at agreements between the different member nations to make sure that if there's any disputes, they have a way to settle it. You have most favored nation status. So if you are doing the same terms and conditions with other countries because you are meeting the minimum qualifications, you have a better opportunity to do trade. The WTO requires you to publish all of your trade and regulations so that other countries know what their expectations are. It's not like a world government. There's no real authority behind it. It's all based on contracts and treaties. So if you violate it, it's not like you could be subject to, an invasion or something or be put in jail, but you could receive poorer trade status, allowing other countries to put tariffs on your products and services that could make it more difficult for you to sell. So if you're going to be participating in the World Trade Organization, if you comply with all of their rules, it can open the door to a lot of markets. The World Bank helps economies in developing countries get access to loans. They actually do something called microloans, which is, I'm not sure if it's covered in this text, but a microloan is when companies or even individuals can loan as little as a couple of $100s, because a couple of $100s in a developing nation could be worth several $1,000s in the United States. And that could help somebody actually establish a local private business that they could start to take advantage of. Countries with extreme poverty, where people have less than a couple of dollars per day, they are really helped by the World Bank. They're able to get access to loans, and they're going to be low interest loans. Interestingly enough, these microloans and these small loans that they give out to countries that are more struggling economically, they have a higher rate of paying back their loans than larger companies in more advanced nations. The International Monetary Fund is built of 189 countries, or it consists of 189 countries. They also help to foster growth and stability by giving policy advice and financing to the member countries. IMF members can contribute to a fund and then you can tap into it. It's almost like having a bank account that you could use if you have a balance of payment issue. So you can't satisfy all of your obligations on your balance of payment problems. You can tap into a fund at the IMF if you've been contributing to it. Trade agreements in global business, I talked about this in class a little bit. We have NAFTA and the successor agreement to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where there's less trade restrictions between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. That's a regional trade agreement. You can have customs unions, common markets, and economic unions as well. Regional trade agreements is like NAFTA that I mentioned. It's now called the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. NAFTA seemed kind of more clever or easier to say. The ASEAN or ASEAN bloc, spelled out here on the map, it's Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Philippines, and Brunei are all part of this trade bloc that's very similar. So they have an agreement between all of those countries that you can sell goods and services across the borders with minimal restrictions or barriers to trade. That's essentially designed to protect that region from outside interference, but it also allows them to have less restrictions internally so that they can profit. A custom union is when countries agree to have free trade on products that they've defined within the agreement. Some things will be free from tariffs, but if they're not included, they will potentially be subject to a tariff. They also have a different tariff for imports from outside the rest of the world, which is known as a common external tariff. The CET is what makes a customs union different from a regional trade. A common market is similar to a customs union, but it also has free movement of resources. So like the European Union was based on a common market initially. It allows people from the different nations within Europe to go and work freely in other places. My wife and children have an Italian passport, but they can go and work in any of the European Union common market areas. I use the EU as an example of a common market because it did come from the common market. The European Union wasn't established until the 1990s, but it's just the next step in it. There's really no internal barriers. There's an adoption of all common external barriers. So it's basically like having a country in terms of the economy. But even though they all have their own different laws and different political systems, from an economic system, it's as if Europe was one nation. It allows free movement of resources such as labor. You can have a common set of economic policies and principles, and the EU is probably the most well-known and largest economic union in the world. Corruption is something to be aware of because different countries have different laws and different ways of doing business. Not to say that the United States is free from corruption, but there are countries that have much higher levels of corruption. And in some countries, what we would consider to be corruption is just considered to be business. So bribery, for example, we would consider it to be unethical and illegal, but in other countries, it's almost like built into the cost of doing business. So you just have to be aware of what the standards are before you go into that country. The next slide has some examples of bribery. I'll let you read through that on the slides individually. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is just a way to try to police some of the corruption that happens from international trade. I'm going to skip over that slide as well, so make sure you read up on it. From a cross-cultural perspective, it's difficult to regulate ethical behavior when different countries view things differently. What could be illegal or unethical in one country is perfectly fine in another. I will probably go have a beer after I finish doing all of this recording. In certain countries, that would be not only illegal, but it would be considered to be kind of a moral evil. So if you are in a different country, it's just a different standard. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong. More clearly, certain things are definitely considered right or wrong, but there's some gray areas here as well that you need to be cognizant of. One of the things that comes up when you do outsourcing specifically are things known as sweatshops. This is a factory that has labor abuse issues, violations. You can have unsafe working conditions. People have been locked into a factory, so they have to work 12 hours a day. Sometimes you'll hear about a fire breaking out and all of the people being burned to death because they can't get out because they were locked in. It still happens today. It had happened in the United States more than 100 years ago, but it is something that does exist in other jurisdictions as well. We have child labor laws in the United States. Other countries may have them or don't enforce them or may not have them at all. So children could be the people making the products that you're buying from overseas. Other countries may have mandatory overtime. We do have mandatory overtime for many people who work on a wage. It's time and a half. It could be more generous in different countries. So you have to be aware of that before you start going over there and violate those laws. You may be able to pay less than the minimum wage in some places. There could be abusive discipline, sexual harassment, violation of various laws and regulations. And if that happens in the other country, it can rub off on your image here. Apple, for example, is getting a lot of criticism. Nike used to get a lot of criticism for the people who were making their shoes. The work environment that they were in, people were profiting, people were getting cheap shoes. The executives at Nike were making millions and billions of dollars. The people who were making the shoes had to work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they made poverty wages, essentially. Finally, the last thing we're going to mention here is just more of a thing to consider. Nationalism is on the rise. That is essentially a belief that your country is better than all of the rest. It's based on patriotism. There was a lot more nationalism around World War II when Hitler took over. The country's financial and political system was based on what they called National Socialism. It was based on nationalism, but it was fascism. Just because they called it National Socialism doesn't mean it was socialist. It was basically fascism where they merged corporatism with the government, and nationalism, which was to exclude other people that were different from you that weren't native to your country. There's a lot more of it, and when you have nationalism, it's harder to have globalist trade because people are going to be more isolationist. Why do we want to do trade with these countries that we don't like? They're taking our jobs. Why do we want to do business with these people that embrace culture that we don't particularly care for? That's becoming more and more prevalent as globalism actually increases more and more. Whether or not nationalism is a reaction to globalism or it's always been there, it's hard to see, but it's undoubtedly a fact that globalism has increased dramatically over the last 50 years but nationalism has increased quite a bit as well. That's it for today. We're going to do chapter 5 next.